Going back to your original article and talking about how North Korea ties into this, what would you say is the significance of having that North Korea Hong Kong relationship, and how strong is it
Mhm.
really?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, my piece it kind of like goes into the weeds about that. In the very beginning, I look at like the Korean War of like what Hong Kong's role in that was. A lot of people, especially like on the Korean War is like the forgotten war for most people. It's the war that it's a very important war for like in this area of the world, but Americans today especially don't remember why it's important, what like the implications are. But besides us, the British also fought in that war, and so did many UN countries on our side. And Hong Kong was sort of like this buffer zone between, strategic location for the British to move their troops onto the Korean Peninsula to like fight this war with us. And Hong Kong is a lot like Korea itself because Korea was occupied by the Japanese for many decades, and the Japanese they also took over Hong Kong during World War II. But during the Korean War, they ended up on opposite sides. So that's the very beginning. But when the Korean War ended, Hong Kong was like the strategic location for the Cold War because it's a former Chinese territory that's owned by the British, which is on like the Western Bloc during like this communism versus capitalism struggle. So you have that. But then when Hong Kong is handed over back to China, the UK actually normalized relations with North Korea shortly after, and now China basically has like way more influence on the Hong Kong island itself for economics, for commerce, for that sort of thing. So basically, as time has gone on, as like this mainland influence has increased in Hong Kong, it's been much easier for these North Korean companies to do cooperation with these Chinese companies. So, as an example, there's like economic zones where basically it's like these enterprises for China and North Korea to cooperate with each other. And within these economic zones, you have these Hong Kong companies, firms that were based in Hong Kong, or are based in Hong Kong, doing this business on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea. But the problem with that is that North Korea is a very heavily sanctioned country, and the sanctions have increased as North Korea has increased its missile testing and its nuclear testing. So on the world stage, North Korea is a pariah. But among the few countries that support North Korea is China. China and also with Russia at the UN has constantly asked for sanctions relief on North Korea. And while they're requesting for the sanctions relief, North Korea is continuing to test missiles, it's continuing to develop nuclear weapons. And of course, while China claims to like agree to like enforce sanctions on the side, things are a bit different. It's letting these businesses run in Hong Kong, to help North Korea launder money, and it's also helping North Korea engage what are known as ship-to-ship transfers. So we're like in on the ocean, basically two vessels can like exchange goods with each other, or in North Korea's case, send crude oil to these North Korean tanker ships, and then the oil goes to North Korea, and that oil, the petroleum, the fuel, that's used to help its weapons program.
So North Korea and Hong Kong trading with each other, how does that impact like the world economy as a whole?
hmm Well, I mean, you have to keep in mind North Korea is like a very, very small economy. So in terms of like world economy, it's a very minimal impact. North Korea actually, well, people don't even realize this, but North Korea actually has normalized relations with most countries. It's really only just like the U.S., Japan, and like a handful of other countries that don't have normalized relations with North Korea. But in North Korea's case, what's happened is because of the sanctions, so many of these countries can't trade with North Korea legally or through the official channels. North Korea is banned from using the American banking system and also many world, banking systems. And so, what the regime needs is a currency because the North Korean won is basically worthless compared to other currencies. It wants like the foreign currencies to boost its economy, but especially it's really not I think useful to look at through like world economic impact. It's more just useful like how does this affect North Korea's economy. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that North Korea has completely sealed itself off from the rest of the world for the most part, and cutting itself off from foreign trade has been very bad for its economy and very bad for its people. There are many food shortages. There's many like shortages of like critical medical supplies too. But before this, China and through Hong Kong and with China, this was like the lifeline for the regime. So because Hong Kong was such like a big business hub for Asia, and because North Korea is so strained by these sanctions, Hong Kong was a very useful route for North Korea to get the currency it needed and to continue running these illegal operations.
Yeah, you're talking about North Korea basically locking itself up in its own prison, I suppose you
Yeah.
could say. I I think when they were showing like COVID deaths or something like that, they're showing like zero.
Hmm.
But that's because, like you were saying, they're not going to tell anyone any of the information outside of its own people. Like we're not going to tell anyone how many people have actually died in North Korea from
Yeah.
COVID. Come on.
It's funny you say that because like North Korea actually submits its own testing data to the World Health Organization, and at NK News we report those numbers. But they always say zero positive cases. But what they say is like this number of people showed influenza-like symptoms or like acute respiratory infection. They don't say positive cases of COVID-19. They say flu symptoms or acute respiratory infection. So they like playing like all these sort of like word games to like get around that. But obviously, we have no idea how many people have COVID in North Korea. Even as much as like it sealed itself up in the rest of the world, there's still ways of viruses spreading even to like the most remote places.
Yeah, I don't think a virus is going to care that you're not trading with other, like America and Japan is recognized. I don't think a virus is going to care about that.
Yeah, but to be fair though, you've probably heard stories that if anybody has COVID in North Korea, they'll be killed. North Korea has many human rights issues, but there's no evidence of that being true. And when we talk about North Korea, I really want to emphasize that we shouldn't overstate the case. We shouldn't exaggerate how bad things are over there because you don't need to exaggerate it. We already know how bad things are for the people over there. I mean, the human rights situation was already terrible, obviously before the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, it's just given the state more excuses to like lock its people up and to like impose more restrictions on movement. And I know that especially like I assume in like your libertarian circles, a lot of people were like complaining about like mask mandates, vaccine mandates, all of that. And of course, there's a healthy debate to be had with those issues, but North Korea's hands down was like the worst restrictions for any country in the world.
Yeah, and I heard someone talk about Japan and how they reacted to it, and I mean they were saying that for the most part it was voluntary. I mean they're kind
Yes.
of saying, yeah, we strongly suggest you wear a mask and you should get a vaccine. And just how the culture is there in Japan, it's
Mhm.
kind of that, follow the leader, I suppose, kind of a culture. And so I would probably guess a very high percentage of people are vaccinated and wear a mask. I mean, even before all this was happening,
Yes.
they were wearing masks anyway. It was just who they are.
Yeah, I've gotten into these debates too. I also, you and me, I think we're in similar circles. We have a lot of conservative and libertarian followers, and there's a lot of anti-mask people and anti-vaccine people. And my view on that's all of a personal choice. That's all about like what you want to do. I'm not going to force you. I'm not comfortable with forcing people to do things and things like that. But I mean, with Japan, it's all voluntary, and because it's voluntary, I think that compels people to just get the vaccine naturally and to just mask up naturally. I've always believed that if you force somebody to do something, you're going to have the opposite effect. And Japan has some of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and that was without any kind of vaccine mandate. And unfortunately, that's a double-edged sword, though, because I think when like masks are technically like not necessary, like legally, but I would imagine that even when the government says you don't have to wear masks anymore, you're still going to have people wearing masks for I think many months, maybe even years, because they're just so used to it now. So that's more of something though that's like you can't really like legalize culture. It's the mentality among the people. It has to be something they come to on their own.
Yeah, and American culture is definitely a lot different than Japanese
Yes.
culture. And just when, like you were saying, how the government was basically telling people, you can see Joe Biden putting on a mask. Oh wow, he looks so cool. Wow, look at that guy, he's so awesome. And then people be like, just wear a mask. I don't know what the problem is. But it's just how the different or how the cultures kind of clash. Like
Yeah, and it's
how,
like
yeah.
well, when you and me talked the last time, which was at the end of 2020, that was when the pandemic was especially bad. And at that point, I said, "Yeah, wear masks. I think it's important, at this stage of where we are now." But I mean, we're like two years removed from all of this now, and the question is like, when is this enough? When can we go back to normal? And I ran a poll on Twitter. I said, so if Trump was like pro mask from the very beginning, do you think Democrats would have the opposite position where they would be anti mask because Trump is pro mask? And conversely, do you think Republicans would be pro mask if like, Trump said, be pro mask? And A lot of people said that, yeah, probably the positions would be reversed because in America, because of the political partisanship and because of how everything's a culture war now, that they probably would do that, regardless of what the science says.